that? And okay, it seems like I
vote for Caitlyn Jenner, right? Insofar as that is likely to be the case, they need to specifically learn to rationalize and give arguments specifically for why they're a good candidate and why they should specifically respect them, which means they are more likely specifically to internally check their biases and for them to show for them to learn and trade off specifically why they are a good candidate for that thing in general. Fourth of all, respect. I think that this is really important. California is has a large, actually libertarian, specifically voting base, i.e. that they are, well, okay, right, I'll get into that. But I think that, which is why specifically it used to swing in the past, right? Insofar as there are a lot of people within California who hate too much state intervention, specifically, I think Caitlyn Jenner specifically has the ability to co-opt these narratives because she has already actively said that she's specifically economically right-wing and things like that. Insofar then as she has a fighting chance, but second of all, in social issues, she's pushed back against Trump and things like that. A lot of political commentators have said that the big tent policies are specifically required in California for them to be some sort of swing. The Republican Party understands this and knows that they need to specifically win this seat for them to specifically look optically better post the Biden-Trump election, which means specifically they'll be able to select that choice because of the big tent that they need, right? Insofar as they understand that, I think that links to the point I specifically made previously. I'll take you guys to 6. Okay, moving on. Secondly, why this would not happen otherwise. I think we understand that she's a very unique queer figure, i.e. that she has changed the sporting fields a lot, but also that she is one of the only Republican trans people specifically that is publicly has enough capital specifically to leverage and be able to run for these sort of things. Note that a lot of Democrat candidates specifically who are transgender, which ran in elections previously, have not been able to win, or specifically there's not much trans representation at all. Right? Insofar then as other queer candidates specifically may not want to run because of the populist tendencies that have come before, this specific thing would not happen otherwise, i.e. that Caitlyn Jenner specifically has been, was quite a shock thing for this specifically to be done, i.e. therefore this shock factor specifically useful for Caitlyn Jenner to weaponize the Republican Party, specifically to weaponize, and it would not specifically happen otherwise. I think for a couple of reasons, the Democrats specifically have candidates who are safe candidates, right? Insofar as there is no need for them to push the boat out on the Democrat Party in California and in other governor seats specifically that they're winning, there's no need for them to run candidates specifically which are like that, which are left field, right? Which are out of the ordinary. Because the only reason that they're able to do that, like AOC did, was because when she challenged the status quo, which is what not a lot of people do, right? So insofar as this wouldn't happen otherwise, I think this is specifically good. Finally, weighing off why LGBTQ acceptance is specifically good. She's going to be elected specifically, if she, even if she's not elected, she will have a long-term specific impact on the influence side of things. Before 6, Kat.
Did the Republican Party stop being racist when Clarence Thomas joined them?
Look, I think this is specifically different, right? Because insofar as California is seen as something that the Republicans want to tackle, they want to specifically be able to win and things like that, and they are putting campaign resources behind that. I think this is specifically important because this means that the narrative specifically of you being able to support her will be increasingly amplified, which I think is more important in this regard. Second of all, this gives signaling effects to the whole of the USA, i.e. we know that the impact of this will be certain because even if they're not elected in the actual election, I think this will show that the Republican Party specifically is willing specifically to shift away from these sort of things in general. I think policy, if that's what opposition want to argue and why it specifically may not be good, is uncertain. Look, debating is not a left-wing echo chamber, or it shouldn't be specifically. Being anti-abortion and things like that specifically is a legitimate stance for certain people if they believe it to be a stance. There's nothing inherently wrong, in logical truism terms, wrong about certain policy stances, right? Which means that is an uncertain thing to say. But what is certain to say is that the Republican Party would just probably run another bigger anyway, which means it's probably symmetric on either side. But what is not symmetric and exclusive is the role model potential that this has, which shows the parties moving in a different direction. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I would now like to welcome Leader of Opposition.
Okay. I'm assuming I'm still audible. If I'm not, just stop me. Cool. I begin in 3, 2, 1. Parth says a lot of things, but very few of them are comparative. Firstly, in terms of the signaling effect and a performative idea of having like a leader or somebody that you can look up to in the party. I think this is likely to happen anyway, given that I will prove why there is pressure for the Republicans to have somebody representative in their party, i.e., that if these people or if the Republicans are known for not being inclusive, for not having specific representational leaders within their party, they're likely to publicize it no matter who steps into the position, i.e., if it doesn't matter if it's Caitlyn Jenner or if it's somebody from the grassroots or like a local gay rights activist that ends up standing for this position, they're likely to publicize it in a way that they're inclusive, that they're doing something new, that this is a new brand that they're taking in to show how inclusive they are. So things like having publicity models or having things like publications or like news media outlets, rallies with this person showing why they're so inclusive is likely to happen on either side, i.e., the point at which we prove to you that there will be some sort of change to make the party more inclusive, the signaling effect is likely to happen. I'm unsure why Caitlyn Jenner is the best person to do so. I'm also going to prove why that is bad in the first place. The second thing I want to talk about is in terms of why this is like going to be good in terms of actually, I'll just get to my points. I think a lot of it is integrated. Cool. The first thing I want to start off by saying is that the police system in America, a lot of them have African Americans within the police force. The entire system is structurally still racist. It is unlikely that this party is going to start checking for internal biases or mechanisms where they're not necessarily being inclusive to trans people in general. I'm going to be very clear what we're arguing for at opening opposition. I think the thing that we're arguing here for is representation for trans communities at all political spectrums. Note that they are definitely represented on the left, like on the left political side, but they don't necessarily have enough representation on the right. Parth was right when they said that this shouldn't be like a left echo chamber. We think that there are transhumans that belong to the right side of the political spectrum that should be represented more, but aren't in status quo. That is what we represent, like that is what we're arguing for in opening opposition. They are also the most important stakeholders in this debate, because note that no matter what happens, these people will be the ones that will be harmed the most. A, because they don't get adequate representation, but B, it is unlikely that Caitlyn Jenner is likely to be elected, i.e., all the harms that are done to these people because they're not adequately represented. Versus, well, like the rest of the people are just like playing politics in general, like you rebut the opponent's point or like you try and get checks and balances. The second thing I want to note before I go ahead is talking about why necessarily checks and balances that exist within the system, political system, should be from within the Republican Party and not coming from outside the Democratic Party. Two reasons why that is the case. First, I think when the changes or when there's push for change from within the Republican Party, it is more likely that there will be change because these are the people that the Republican Party depends on voters for. But secondly, in terms of having checks and balances, parties are unlikely to be held accountable because a lot of times opposition parties always point out things that a current party is wrong for, i.e., no matter what the Republican Party does, the Democrats are likely to point out fallacies in their problems, which is unlikely to make them make actual changes in their policies in the first place, which means that they need an internal push, which is what we are arguing for. So what does this look like? I think the first thing I want to say is that Biden's Democratic Party has put pressure on the Republicans to be more inclusive and care about inclusion rights, which looks like appointing people in important positions, having people that are like that belong to the LGBTQ community in like positions of influence and things like that. Know that this is enough pressure on the Republican Party to show that they are inclusive in some way or the other. When this is a status quo, the Republican Party has to make some sort of changes to make sure that they're inclusive. This can be having like more better public speech, rallies or like public discourses in a way that is more inclusive and more considerate of like LGBTQ people or like just gay rights in general. I think that these kind of changes are harder to make when you just have a person that is tokenistically standing in up for you, because no, this is a populist policy, like politics also works, right? You have this one person who is charismatic and a person that labels up the entire nation or your entire party in a way, which shows that, oh, look, we're making change. So here, our change is Caitlyn Jenner. It is unlikely we're going to be held accountable for the problems that we have within our party that might be structurally wrong or not representative of transhumans that are on the right, because we don't necessarily need to do so because we have Caitlyn Jenner standing for elections. Look, we're already inclusive. Note that this is incredibly hard to make. You get more surface level and grassroots levels changes on our side of the house when you're not putting a person in like as a tokenistic model or a tokenistic representative standing for elections, when you rather have like when you rather materialize the pushes that are coming from within the party, because this party needs to look more inclusive to get more votes that come from people, i.e. that you make more changes that are more grassroots based, and secondly, more representative to the trans humans that belong to like the right, that belong to the right wing. Cool. What does this look like? Why tokenistic things are bad? I think that firstly is that it takes away the ability to actually put pressure on the Republican Party to make changes. Know that once you're tokenistic, and I've outlined why that is necessarily bad, as in you're not likely to take accountability for the problems within your party, i.e. like you're not necessarily going to check in for internal biases and how you talk specifically, because you have this whole model where the entire discourse is focused on. I think what you're taking away is the actual push that you can give towards this party to make certain changes. What does this look like? It looks like people on the right, on from grassroots, pushing politicians to have at least maybe the bare minimum of an inclusive policy for like trans people. I think that this is something that is unlikely to happen on either side, because note, once Caitlyn is elected, maybe they'll go for like a tokenistic idea, but I'm unsure why Caitlyn will be elected. Not proven by Gov. Okay, cool. Oh wait, before I go ahead, does anybody have a POI? Yes, CG.
Yeah, sure. So do you think that Caitlyn Jenner is likely to get the Republican nomination for governor in California?
So I don't necessarily think this debate should be based on if she will get the nomination or not in the first place. Because I think the popularity effect or the signaling effect it will create is likely to be the same. Even if she doesn't get the nomination, they're still going to be like, oh, look, we had somebody standing for the community. That means that there is still somebody that represents the right, the trans people in the right. Secondly, I think that is easy to dismiss people out, but I think the signaling effect or the popularity thing, which shifts the discourse out to just making the Republican Party look more inclusive, is still likely to exist. If she doesn't get elected, people are just going to be like, oh, but look, we do have people on the right that want to be represented. It just has to be a better game of politics. I think the impacts remain the same. What are the impacts? The first is that you take away actual space for representation that people can have, or actual space for actual changes that can take place in the party for having more inclusive policies or more inclusive discourse that exists generally, which you wouldn't be able to otherwise, because Caitlyn is just standing there like a tokenistic model, and you don't necessarily have to take accountability for what you do. Why? Because you don't get internal push to make these changes. Outside checks and balances exist, but those parties never care about those outside checks and balances anyway, unless it's a huge scandal, which is unlikely to happen. And even if it does, Gov needs to provide, definitely there'll be a scandal. I think that as long as you're not being representative of like your the people within your party, you don't have equitable politics. Yeah, for all those reasons, opening up.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Oh, quick caveat. I am speaking from a shelter because my country is in a bitchy situation. I don't have the best of the signal right now, so if at any point I get disconnected, just let me know. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, I don't know much about US politics. I know quite a bit, however, about role models and what they need to work. I'm going to do this in 2 parts. Firstly, I'm going to weigh out policy of the debate. This is going to clash both with OO's claims about, having better policies for LGBT and why we might lose them as a mutual trade-off with you feeling like you already have a token or whatever. And secondly, on why we think we have a role model under our side, which is better for the LGBT community, independent on whether or not Caitlyn Jenner gets the nomination. But before that, few pieces of extensive battle and some framing. Important piece of framing in relation to perhaps CO, but also parts of OO. And that is why the trans community is not the same as the African American community or other marginalized groups. Because to say we have many tokens and they never made the Republican Party less racist or whatever is not actually making the right comparison. There are few crucial things that are unique to the trans community and to transphobia in the way that it takes place. People think that it is a trend. People who are transphobic think that it is not something natural that you're born with or whatever, but rather some fad like the transgenders or whatever they like to call it, meaning that they think that it is going to pass at some point soon. They think that it is not going to be good for their electoral options in the long run, and meaning that they think that these are not people they are as empathetical towards and likely to align in any other way unless they change their mind about it. Secondly, they are afraid that it will impact their own kids. A white Republican woman isn't concerned that she's going to give birth to an African American boy, even if she's really, really racist. But she is afraid that her kid might be taken with the trend of the trans community or the queer community in general. Thirdly, the fact that they think that it is a mental illness, meaning that they think that they are doing them a favor. You cannot just liberalize them in other ways and make them shift towards becoming better humans by the fact that some of them maybe support small government and less intervention in human rights, because they think that they are defending trans people when they are harming their rights. They think they are defending them for making a terrible decision based on their mental illness. This is why the only way to combat this is having actual good role models within the conservative community that they respect and listen to, that show them that you can have someone who they perceive to be rational, good enough to be in positions of power and decision-making positions in order to actually break these stereotypes. Second piece of extensive rebuttal to OO, mostly on the idea of this being a trade-off with other stuff. No analysis, check your notes, as to why other stuff are likely to happen, why the Republican Party is likely to make other sorts of changes for the queer community if they wouldn't have had this tokenism. Secondly, no analysis on why it's mutually exclusive, like the fact that you have a token that the Democrats don't even care about because they view Caitlyn Jenner as a bigot because she's anti-abortion and anti-immigration and many other things. So probably they don't get away with other shit they do. They still need to do that. So we don't think this is actually mutually exclusive. Let's talk about role models. Why do we think that Caitlyn Jenner is a role model, regardless of whether she's nominated, winning, etc., just the mere fact that she's a candidate? The fact that as a process of her candidacy, the biggest thing that she talks about and raises awareness to is likely to be her transition. Why is that likely to be the case? Maybe she would want people to talk to her about policy, but within the Republican Party, as well as within the context of the US elections in general, the thing that people are likely to hear about the most and see most in the news, etc., is her transition, right? This is what she is different in. This is what makes her unique, different to other candidates. So they are not likely to be overly focused about her opinion on abortions because you have a gazillion Republicans saying those things. They are much more likely to be curious and actually get screen time about her transition. These are the points that the mere fact that she's invited to interviews, in talk shows, in Fox News, in the media channels of conservatives, and talking about the process of being a trans woman and a past athletic in a very masculine environment is a unique actual view that we get into the lives of trans people that we wouldn't get otherwise. Secondly, the fact that she has to be legitimized as someone who could be trusted in decision-making positions. Every party, and especially the Republican Party, which has one advantage compared to the Democratic Party, they are much, much better in being united and not infighting with each other, are likely to keep their dirty bags inside. I don't know the English for this, sorry, but it means that even if they have criticisms towards Caitlyn Jenner internally, they are not likely to speak them out because they know that if she's going to be their candidate, they are harming their own party. They are shooting themselves in the foot. So everyone has an incentive to shut up about their transphobic opinions for at least a few months and likely to actively silence. And when other Republicans, even not elected representatives, but people in the public, in the news, are going to say transphobic shit, you're going to see Republican nominees speaking in her defense, saying she is all right. We can trust her. She's not mentally ill. We can trust her to make important decisions for the country. They will have to defend her because they know that everything they say against her might backfire against them in the future. They are going to have to legitimize her and talk to her, and actually from a viewpoint of someone who says legitimate things, especially when they also agree with most of the policies she supports, so they are not likely to call her insane because they support the things that she believes in and they want to present them as rational ideas. Before I move on, closing extension.
Do you think Caitlyn Jenner is likely to win? And if not, why not?
I don't think she is, and I don't care. I'm going to soon make some weighings against policy. Cool. Why do we think that she's a unique role model and we won't get others like that? Because OO says, oh, just have another queer Republican run for office because we've seen just so many of them. Few responses on that. A, the fact that there are very few queer people who get to positions of power in the first place, especially in the Republican Party. B, the fact that it is even rare for queer people to get positions of power in general in politics because Democrats tried to run a trans woman once and failed because they can't run on tokenism. Republicans aren't going to vote Democrat because of a trans woman, so you're not going to have any other trans person running for office in general. Thirdly, just the fact that she is a trans woman and Republican makes her more unique than other potential candidates you have, because you need someone that actual conservatives look up to, because otherwise you won't change minds. Wayne, why all of this is much more important than policy or anything else? A, this is true whether she is elected or not. B, it is true. The counterfactual is probably another Republican running for office, which probably would have similar opinions to her own, so no difference in policy. C, the fact that it is long run, not only in these short-term elections. And D, the fact that it is going to have widespread impact, as the message will impact federally on the entirety of the United States, not only within California. For all those reasons, beg you to propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I'm going to assume that I'm audible. POIs in the chat, please. I will come to you when I'm ready. That's out of the way. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. Panel, I think that there is an issue with the government case in that they want to claim in Deputy Prime Minister that there is absolutely no reason that we can give as to why this pressure to have inclusivity on the Republican platform is ever going to come about, apart from through this tokenistic gesture of electing Caitlyn Jenner. Prashasti gives a number of reasons within her speech as to why it is likely that there is going to be representation coming through the grassroots, irrespective of whether or not Caitlyn Jenner herself get the gubernatorial candidacy. I'm going to quickly run through those and remind you so that Deputy Prime Minister can't gaslight you into thinking they weren't there, and then I'm going to explain why they're enough to win the debate. Firstly, we say that the pressure for these things is going to exist as a result of the fact that Biden's government exists. It is something that has a large degree of inclusivity within it, and it is something that creates a unique pressure for the Republicans to try and recapture this voter base. Secondly, we say if pressure for tokenism cannot therefore be removed, then it has to be expedited through something. Note this is also implicit within opening government's own analysis. At the point at which they tell you, and we agree, that there are individuals within the Republican community who probably would want to be on the right wing based on their policy positions, but feel excluded because of their trans identity. We think that at the point at which this pressure necessarily does exist, that this pressure has to be allowed to spring forth within the Republican platform at some point. We say that if it is denied through tokenism with Jenner, it will appear through grassroots instead. We prefer that alternative. In so much of that alternative does exist, we are therefore able to take the debate against opening government. Next, with regards to the greater point that they make, I think that when they say that Jenner is likely to be able to platform trans opinions correctly, on this analogy against African Americans and how they are different, a few things to note here. Firstly, with regards to American discourse on trans issues, there is already a large Republican belief, something that is explicitly upheld by Jenner, that being trans is a mental illness. It is something that is a direct dysphoria that can be treated effectively through transition therapy and through the ability to perform a different gender. Note that this means that Hadar's claim that Republicans will no longer be fearful about this mental illness coming to pass is in fact reinforced by this candidacy, because this exact narrative of trans individuals being mentally ill is something that is explicitly reinforced. Even if they can claim that there is some degree of policy improvement for trans individuals based on the fact that dysphoria can be effectively treated on these things, the overall narrative remains the same, that this is something that is not legitimate, and therefore this hatred remains within, and there is still the belief that this is something that can pass on the belief that this mental illness can find some other way of being treated and can be taken to a different position. Before I go on, yes, go on, OJ.
Of course, people will still think that it can happen to them because it really can. The difference is that now they will see it as a legitimate thing, as not a mental illness, because you put a position of power.
Look, someone being given a position of power A, is not likely to occur, given that we do not think that it is likely that either she is going to get the Republican nomination or win the election. This means that the position of power analysis doesn't function. Secondly, note that the Republicans being prepared to back her in the most marginal manner by allowing her to run on their platform without any actual support in terms of trying to help her win the candidacy or trying to help her win the election is not likely to therefore destroy this idea of mental illness. Note thirdly that someone losing an election in an embarrassing landslide, as is the likely thing based on the current polling, is not going to make one seem to be a highly credible political candidate and reinforces this same narrative. Next, on the impact on left-wing communities, I think that it's generally true, as coming out from OG, that California tends to be quite libertarian, tends to be quite openly liberal. I think at the point at which there is also a large liberal community within California who is already kind of within the LGBTQ plus sphere, I think that there is a significant movement within that as well that wants to drop the T from said activism. Note that we have this consistently throughout the world in that groups that have a large tie to hating the Republican Party for a few reasons. Firstly, the tribalism that Prime Minister already tells you about, why people are likely to vote with a party that they are already engaged with. Secondly, with regards to the fact that there is a large historicity of abuses from the Republican Party onto groups within the LGBTQ plus community, for example, lesbians and gays during the AIDS epidemic, at the point at which someone from the trans community is seen as aligning with the Republicans who have this degree of historical hatred from this community, we say that it is likely to reinforce the beliefs of marginal sects within that group that want to remove trans individuals from the conversation, believe that they are actively working against the interests of the rest of the LGBTQ plus community, and are likely to therefore create greater harms along those vectors. We think at the point at which you are able to construct a narrative that trans individuals are betraying the rest of the community, or siding with Republicans over the Democrats who you have a tribal affiliation to and who you believe are likely to be on your side in the long run, we say that this accrues greater harms in terms of A, Jenner directly being abused by people who would otherwise want to support her, and B, creating a greater platform and a greater degree of narrative push for turfy groups within the leftist community. We say, A, this divides the trans vote. Secondly, we say it divides the LGBTQIA plus community. Both things are harmful. Finally, with regards to how grassroots does end up occurring, we say that even if Jenner is being moderately successful and is able to have these discussions, firstly, that as soon as she has come out as the Republican trans individual, that she will necessarily dominate all space. If you're a news reporter, if you're a late night TV host, if you want to hear any right-wing opinion on trans individuals, Jenner is now the person that you turn to. Note at the point at which this is a singular narrative and one that is not necessarily correct or accurately representative of A, the trans community as a whole, or B, Republican trans individuals, that this necessarily ends up dominating the conversation in a disproportionate and unfair manner. We think the alternative here is that when this conversation is not being dominated by a singular voice, when Jenner is not running for a governor position and therefore does not have a direct political affiliation, there is an ability for grassroots movements within the Republican Party to still spring up and for these individuals to capture that particular platform. Note that Jenner still has a platform as a trans individual who is very rich and very powerful and is able to spread a narrative along these lines on the same basis. We think, therefore, that the buy-in that OG talks about does not occur anymore on their side, and we accrue significant marginal benefits elsewhere. Therefore, vote away. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Member of Government.
Oh, sorry, I was looking for a word. Timer. Cool. Before I start, I just want to share my joy in the fact that I wrote my Republican notes in red and my Democrat notes in blue, and I just think I really enjoyed that. Cool. It was also like I had those three, like that and black, and so like it just worked out for me. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do something novel in this debate. I'm going to run an economics extension. One main thing in my speech. I'm going to be talking about a market failure and what market failure is today and why now in the status quo, the Democrats don't have an incentive to do anything besides the bare minimum for the LGBT community and the trans community included within that, and why this then changes tomorrow with the sudden shock of such a public trans figure running against them. Couple notes of framing. Sure, we agree that probably the Republicans aren't going to change or aren't going to change significantly. And we also agree that we're probably not going to win because we think it is harder to coalesce against around a more divisive individual. But our case is not reliant on that. Our case is reliant on the fact that Caitlyn Jenner has decided to run and publicize this, and all the news media coverage is everywhere across my Facebook feed. We're talking about the fact that Caitlyn is running for the governorship, right? So firstly, and why Democrats don't have an incentive to do anything besides the bare minimum today. Because right now there is a market failure in which they have a trapped audience, right? It is not hard for me to say I am the lesser of evils when I do nothing, just because the other party is actively antagonistic towards you. It is not yet hard for me to attract votes or to rest on my laurels in a situation where the other side is actively bad in order to garner the votes. The problem with that is that I never have the incentive to be anything better than neutral, right? That means that every time that the Democrats have to pander to centrists in order to get their votes, every time you have to cater to middle America in order to try to sway them, the first thing to go, the first thing that ends up being all talk but no policy, ends up being LGBT policy, ends up being the policy in order to advocate for trans people to be able to transition, to be able to change their gender on their legal documents, able to do have separate bathrooms in school, the bathroom issue in schools. All of these things are the things that are first to go when you think that these votes are already locked in to your party. Why is this then the most important thing in this debate? I think that firstly, California is literally the bluest, most liberal base for Democrats across America right now. They make New York look like a swing state, and the idea that this is anything besides that is laughable. Secondly, I think this is where the shift is more likely to happen. And thirdly, I think even more than just resonating within the Democratic Party in California, this is likely to resonate throughout the party across the entire federation. How does Caitlyn then change the party? Because I think Caitlyn shocks the complacency, because it shows them that their voter base is not as locked in as they thought it was, right? They cannot rely on the fact that all the LGBT community is going to consistently vote for them. Even if Caitlyn Jenner doesn't get a large amount of LGBT supporters, because what they campaign on is unlikely to be trans issues, they still will have a large representation of themselves in media. They are still going to be spotlighted and focused on the fact that they are trans and the fact that they are Republican, and all of these things are going to show and are going to constantly be blazoned across all the headlines, telling the Democratic Party that what they are doing is not enough, and it forces them to compete, because what they are competing for at that point is the same voter base. The only reason that the Republicans would want to platform them, and the way that Caitlyn Jenner is able to differentiate themselves from the competition, is by showing that they are trans, and for having trans people hope that the fact that they are trans means that they care about each other. What this now means is that both of these parties have to then compete to who cares more about the trans and LGBT community, right? This forces the Democratic Party to make a stance and try to actively show that they are a better party to vote for these individuals, right? I think that this is a more likely tactic than attacking Caitlyn, because I think that they have a large platform insofar as not only are they like Olympian / Americana, and it is hard to argue that because of the blatant patriotism that ingrained it and carved into all Americans' bones. So it's hard to say, this Olympian person is a bad thing, but also just their entire family owns a shit ton of liberal media. Insofar as when the liberal media starts, or the Democratic Party starts bashing on Caitlyn, then all Kim Kardashian or Caitlyn or Kendall Kardashian or the rest of the case have to fucking do is say, you are attacking my parent, and that is fucking ghastly of you. And then that does a backlash back onto the Democrat community. It is actively harmful for them. So in order for them to be able to have, to be able to compete, they have to show why they are better than them. And what this means is that they have to compete with them. And so what this translates into, that they have to stop just talking about why they are better. They have to start showing why they are better. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so the problem with this is that most trans people hate Caitlyn Jenner and are not going to vote for her because she holds a lot of terrible beliefs about trans people. So
this is true. This is true. I don't think that many people are going to vote for Caitlyn Jenner. I don't think the trans community will. But what it will show the Democrats is that they don't have a lock on the community, right? That the people within this community aren't just going to vote Democrat because of this. Whether or not on voting day, the trans community shows up and has somehow registered Republican to vote in primaries, which I don't understand how that happens. But I don't know whether or not that happens. The amount of media coverage, the amount of discussion of the fact that why it is worthwhile to vote red instead of voting blue. How could a trans person make this decision to run on Republican platforms? The discourse about how the Democrats have then failed the trans community is something that is likely to be a lot more prevalent, regardless of Caitlyn Jenner, but just based on the discourse and the way media has the incentive to portray and sensationalize this. All of these things trickle down into the fact that the Democrats are now actively being told that and actively thinking that they have lost grip on the LGBT vote. And what this means is now that they have an incentive to reassert their dominance and reassert their hegemony on the voting practices of the LGBT community, because this is the voting base that they are most likely to have next election, while middle Americana is a lot more swing. For all of these reasons, we have shown you more definite outcomes, and we have won.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome member of opposition.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Oh shit. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. What we're going to prove from CO is that Caitlyn Jenner is a horrible person who holds a lot of horrible beliefs about trans people. And in Gov's world, she has a huge platform to spread those beliefs in a way that would never be possible otherwise, radically shifting the conversation around trans people in a very toxic direction. So this is going to take OG at their best, because let's say that OO is wrong and the Republican Party does meaningfully change, as OG argues it will. We will flip OG by proving that this change is an actively bad one, because it doesn't really consist of the Republican Party getting meaningfully less transphobic. They, in fact, might get more transphobic because it will introduce a bunch of new transphobic ideas into the conversation for the first time. Before I prove that, though, I'm going to quickly take out CG, because Kat and I had a lot of fun talking about the ways their case doesn't work. So will this work to make Democrats less complacent? No. So first thing to say is that they were not complacent to begin with, for 3 reasons. Firstly, richer white trans people, e.g. the demographic that Caitlyn Jenner belongs to, already vote Republican. It is just not the case that trans people monolithically vote Democrat. They already know that they have to appeal to specifically richer white trans people, and they have to be good for trans people in order to get those votes. Secondly, voting is not mandatory in the US, and many trans people stay home on election day. Democrats know that they can get some of those people not to stay home on election day by having good policies for trans people, so they're not complacent for that reason. Thirdly, individual Democrats have to run against other Democrats in primary elections, and they want to win the trans vote in those primary elections because that's a significant number of people, and so they push good policies for trans people for that reason. So for all of these reasons, Democratic politicians are not complacent in the ways they are saying, which is why in New York I can get my name changed fairly easily, and in Georgia I can't. Like their example is just factually wrong. The other thing to say is that most trans people hate Caitlyn Jenner and will not vote for her, meaning that even if Democrats were complacent, this will not shake them out of their complicity. And CG makes a very weird concession in response to my POI when they say, yes, most trans people will not vote for Caitlyn Jenner, but it will somehow happen anyway. Like, I'm sorry, but if most trans people don't vote for Caitlyn Jenner, then presumably Democrats have polls and know that most trans people won't vote for Caitlyn Jenner. Therefore, they know that they have to change nothing in order to keep those votes. So yeah, CG out. So first, so now let's talk about how we're going to beat OG. So we agree with OG that Caitlyn Jenner will be asked to talk about trans issues a lot and will have ample opportunity to spread her various positions on trans people. And she is also the only trans person that most people have heard of, meaning that when she is given a huge platform like the kind that you get when you're constantly being interviewed and constantly on the debate stage, what she says and what she does will be very formative for how people see trans people. So why are Caitlyn Jenner's ideas bad for the trans movement? And like, why is she as a person being the representative generally bad for trans people? 3 reasons. Firstly, she is someone who has had millions and millions of dollars to transition. Like her transition cost $6 million. I'm never going to see that much money in my life. I am never going to look as good and as much like a cis woman as Caitlyn Jenner does. But by being prominent like this, she sets the expectation that trans women should pass and should look like cis women in that way. That on its own is an incredibly toxic expectation. Secondly, she tries to paint herself as one of the good trans people and doesn't support most types of trans activism and actively criticizes trans people who do support this kind of activism. This feeds into the narrative that trans people may have some legitimate problems, but they should deal with it through like debate and like petitions that don't do anything and absolutely nothing else, that they should stop being whiny and shut up and stop disrupting our lives. This makes trans activism actively more toxic when there is someone with a big platform criticizing it, which didn't really exist previously. Thirdly, she opposes many things that are important for trans people and gets a huge platform to tell people about these ideas for the first time. These are things like she opposes transition being covered by health insurance. She's economically right-wing, so like that's, she doesn't want health insurance to have to cover transitions. She opposes non-binary people being considered legitimate and valid. She opposes like pronoun usage being considered hate speech and being like considered under, like intentional misgendering being considered hate speech and being prosecuted as such. So I just want to note that a lot of these things are completely new ideas that the Republican Party is not currently talking about, or if they are, they're not doing it that much. In America, trans rights are still a fairly niche issue, and many Republicans are completely silent on the issue. But she has a massive platform to tell people about these ideas for the first time and to expose people to these ideas in a way that they never would have been exposed to otherwise, actively making the population more right-wing. So let's concretely go into what this means. I think it means 3 really important things. So firstly, the Republican Party gets actively worse. This is flipping OG. So OG says that Caitlyn Jenner will serve as a role model. She won't, because she will paint herself as one of the good ones and will contrast herself to trans people who actually want meaningful change. She's not going to change anyone's mind. She's going to say, oh yeah, those non-binary people are totally mentally ill. Like she's not going to do any of the things that OG wants her to do. She like Republicans are just going to start saying that all trans people should be like Caitlyn Jenner. She's not going to prove that it isn't a mental illness, because like to some extent this happens just from Caitlyn Jenner existing, but without the huge platform of a candidacy. But also the Republican Party can't really censor members who continue to say transphobic things. OG never gave us a mechanism for that. But what this does do is it put things on the Republican agenda that weren't there before. It now becomes acceptable for Republican politicians to say that non-binary people are mentally ill, which they were not previously saying, or to say that transition shouldn't be covered by health insurance. Again, not a huge talking point among Republicans previously, but now it becomes far more legitimized when they have a trans person saying these things, and when this becomes a much more popular stance because people believe it more widely. OG.
The thing is, the status quo is most of these rights not existing legally, and not a shift backwards being possible, but only a shift forwards, which can only be generated if you give the one only trans.
Okay,
for these good changes in the.
Okay, you kind of cut out there, but I think I got the point. So basically, one of these rights do exist in some places kind of by default. Like in a lot of states, it didn't start out as very difficult to get your name changed, for example, and it can be made more difficult. But secondly, culturally, you get more resistance to trans rights when this becomes the narrative. And that's the second thing I wanted to say. You get more negative ideas throughout society about trans people because this puts new bad ideas into the conversation in a way that they weren't previously and makes these ideas seem legitimate when a prominent trans person is saying them. This means that when trans people protest for their rights, you suddenly get much more resistance. Previously, a fairly small group, but a group that has a lot of votes and that has activist organizations that donate money to campaigns can get change done as long as the wider population is just kind of ambivalent and neutral on it, because the calculation for a politician is some people really want this and no one really opposes it, so I might as well get the votes of the people who really want it. But now lots more people oppose these good rights because Caitlyn Jenner has put this into the conversation. Thirdly, other trans celebrities who would control the public narrative otherwise as they gradually come to prominence are crowded out, and these celebrities would probably do a better job because most trans people are way better than Caitlyn Jenner. We really got unlucky with her. Very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Government Whip.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Look, panel, I think there are two main questions in this debate. The first is, who do we think Jenner is more likely to impact? And the second is the practical impacts of this running and of this just running for a nomination. But first, just a few answers to CO. So CO don't address any of Rachel's analysis on why the Democrats talk big game, but only never take any actual actions, and they take those actions where it's the least needed. So the example we get is it's easier to change your name in New York rather than Georgia. Do you know why that's true? Because the Democrats, even though they have power both in Georgia and in either Congress or the Senate, one of them, I don't understand things, US politics, and even though they have the majority of those things, have an active incentive not to push those things in the places where it needs most and on a federal level. It's easy to pass laws where everyone agrees that it's a good thing and we have such a liberal environment like New York. It's harder to push for that change where it's needed most in states like Georgia and on a federal level. This is why we see these things happening less, because there's no active incentive. Because in order to try and get votes from Trump and in order to try to get votes from the Republicans, you need to pander to the centrists. You need to pander to people who still believe in Americana and to people who want you to fight for their rights and not for the rights of other people, and sometimes see that as an active trade-off. So the Democrats have an active incentive to talk about it where it gets them things, not to talk about it and not take active action in places where that policy might cause a trade-off in other people not voting. And that is why we want to see them change that, take active steps and on a federal level where they need it the most. So I think when we say that rich trans people are already voting Republican and voting is not mandatory, so trans people don't do anything, A, that's an assertion, but B, that just doesn't address the heart of Rachel's analysis on why even if Democrats address this today, when it comes to after being elected, doing active policy, that is where they fail and that is where there's a market failure. And also just doesn't address the fact that we just think most of them will vote Democrat anyways because Republican is worse. And then we have their whole case on why Caitlyn Jenner makes a really shitty situation slightly shittier. We're just not clear why this is so horrible. A lot of the examples we get for agendas that weren't on the Republican agenda before were. Not criminalizing pronoun use is a thing that is on the Republican agenda. Being against the bathroom bill or pro the bathroom bill, whichever direction the bathroom bill goes, is a thing that's on the Republican agenda. And the more that we actually can get a concession that Democrats do talk about these issues, the more we think Republicans today do also talk about these issues, but counteract that. And then the question is, and then we just don't think there's that big a change. But also, Jenner's platform is not exclusive in running for governor. Like the media attention she can get and her TikTok presence and her Twitter presence and her ideas and thoughts already exist. And notice this is a concession coming out of DLO. So you can't claim that it doesn't exist because same bench, you have to have the same line. So the platform exists, and Jenner having these strong opinions and strongly believing in them enough to want to run for governor in political office, whether or not she runs, is still going to express those things because she believes them strongly and is still going to be used as a token for those ideas within the community. And the specific platform of running for political office only changes, and that the question is, what ideas and what community is associated with which political side. And this is where our analysis on why the Democrats are likely to perceive of this as a threat, whether it's really a threat or not, for multiple reasons come in, and we don't get engaged on this because honestly, Democrats are often just as disconnected and therefore unlikely to be aware how trans people are going to vote regardless, and therefore have an incentive to try and fight this. Because even if it's unlikely, it forces them to be scared of it and take active stances and show active effort, because that is going to be their way to differentiate themselves, because it's much harder to attack Jenner directly, because the specific words associated with each political side, if LGBTQ is immediately associated with the Democrats or Republicans, is now at stake. So they need to take a larger stance, so the media attributes it to them instead. And because you want to try to address the question and discourse of how someone who is part of this community could go so far right, so you want to actually distinguish yourself in that you do actual policies, even if other people are representative. You now need to be more than representative. You now need to show practical impacts. How does this affect the who is Jenner likely to impact? Look, opening quibble a little bit about the Republican Party and where we'll get more change. Make a weird claim about grassroots movement is better without actually addressing why Caitlyn Jenner isn't part of this grassroots movement. Insofar as Caitlyn Jenner is actually accepted by the Republican Party, we think it's likely to be a result of the pressure put on them by the Democratic Party. She's likely to represent a lot of the internal change that OO want, and we think that if what OO want is internal change, then they're getting it in the form of Caitlyn Jenner, and we just don't understand the difference between the kinds of policies and things she will represent as opposed to the kinds of policies and things other people will represent. OG gives some X on why the Republican Party is likely to take a less transphobic stance without impacting what this means, given that the policies that Jenner is likely to promote are anti-trans and LGBTQIA, unlike anti-trans women participating in sports and or anti-marriage rights. So the impact is really not clear. What we show you is that the question is where it's more likely to lead to actual change and directly promoting policies that are likely to make people's lives better. We show you that opening was wrong in ignoring the Democratic Party, and why this wakes up a sleeping Democratic Party to push for those changes now that it has the power to do so in Congress and the platform to do so, so that in places like Georgia, where it's harder to get these things to pass, you make people's lives slightly better. Is it going to be easy for trans people to, are things going to be magically fixed? No, but you are going to be able to promote things like choosing your pronoun and changing your name in far wider variety. Before I continue, sure, CO.
Okay, so many Americans are ambivalent on things like non-binary people right now, or whether health insurance should cover transition. When Caitlyn Jenner has a platform of a campaign compared to the echo chamber of her social media to discuss these things further, they go from ambivalent to hostile, which makes it harder to get those things passed.
Thank you, Gwen. Except what we explained to you is that this also leads to a harder stance from the Democratic Party that will counter that, and they will hear that too in the media. So you can't just assume they will buy in more to Caitlyn Jenner's stance as opposed to other trans people who are now forced to speak out. Let's talk about the practical impacts. Look, OG tried to weigh out policy. I'm going to weigh policy back in, and it's going to sound very familiar to you. A, this is true whether or not Jenner is elected. Notice that we explained why it's true. B, long-term policies. Notice that we showed to you long-term policies that aren't abstract role modeling, which we don't understand, but actual change in people's lives. 3, shift to a federal level. Notice that was exactly our examples and what we're actively promoting. But D, the alternative is a less good Republican that isn't trans, that doesn't represent something that the Democrats need to stand for and differentiate themselves and having practical implications for. And therefore, the Democrats are more likely, because of Caitlyn Jenner is a better Republican, to actually make change and to promote active policy. At the end of the day, we are the ones who show you the real practical impacts of Caitlyn Jenner running. And for those reasons, please propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome opposition whip.
Hear me well.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Quick weighing to opening opposition on 2 cases. 1, there's stuff on otherwise more exclusivity, more inclusivity in the Republican Party. A, I think that's less proximate so far as it happens in the future. I have no idea when their grassroots movements are going to magically spring into existence. But secondly, that I think the case that Gwen gives you about the Republican Party becoming actively more hostile to trans people and trans issues is actually logically prior to that, insofar as at the point where that happens, the OO harm becomes much more likely, because at the point where the party is more hostile, fewer trans people are willing to join to create the grassroots movement that opening opposition talks about, i.e. we massively empower their impact and make it significant significantly likelier, at which point we're beating them on that score. Secondly, with regard to changing the left wing, I think this is largely marginal insofar as Caitlyn Jenner is already Republican. Lots of people who hate her already use her as an example. I do not know why you need the governorship for that. Specifically, the analysis that Gwen gives you about why the governorship and like the campaign for that is something that is unique in terms of shaping image, what you need in order for that case to make any sense at all. But honestly, I think it is largely trivial. Let's talk about opening government. I think that the stuff that they have with regard to Caitlyn Jenner being unique is probably true right now. However, I would posit that there are probably trans people who are like right-leaning, insofar as I don't think it's inherently bad to be right-leaning, who can come up later, who can also be celebrities. Like, yes, people can become celebrities within the next 5 years. The field of celebrity is not something that is completely static. No idea where opening opposition gets that assertion. I'm going to counter assert and say, I think statistically speaking, it is probable it will happen. And they have no way of like analyzing that because they would probably have to do that in their case, not in a point of information. Secondly, on acceptance, I think acceptance at best happens to like people who can conform to an incredibly inaccessible standard for reasons that Gwen points out, i.e. the framework of like legitimate transgender experience is going to be shaped by Caitlyn Jenner, who is immensely rich and who specifically has massive incentive to define herself against people that are, you know, more alienating to the Republican Party and to people who vote for them, specifically in order to gain their support, i.e. by framing herself as one of the good ones and framing specifically as the other people not being as relevant and being the easiest possible person to like have acceptance for. That means that the only people that actually benefit from that are the people who already have it relatively easiest, because they are already people who don't like take off anyone the wrong way, because they are likely to be A, incredibly likely to pass, B, likely to be incredibly wealthy, which means that they are largely safe from a lot of discriminatory behavior, because at the point where you don't need your job as much, you're likely to be relatively safer from employment, like housing discrimination, etc. Secondly, on their stuff with regard to, oh, she stood up to Trump, so she's likely to be nice, which is probably the only preemption that Gwen's case gets. Like, A, I think standing up to Trump on a couple of things does not mean that you're otherwise likely to be good. I think that it means that specifically when Trump is talking about the issues that affect her and her life, she's willing to do that. I think that the problem is, though, that she still said that she would vote for Trump, at which point she's also shown a massive willingness to make concessions to that kind of thing at the point where it is like politically conducive for her. At the point where she now has a massive political incentive to do so, insofar as she presumably wants to win a nomination, I think she is progressively likelier to engage in that behavior because it gets her Trump voters, as opposed to engaging in the behavior that is alienating to them, that would be pushing more trans rights, because that loses her Republican like primary voters, which means that she is likely to engage in the behavior that Gwen characterizes, not in the behavior that opening up government characterizes. Thirdly, on the notion that you now get policies in the Republican Party that help trans people, or at the very least that you cannot do policies that hurt them. I think the problem with that is that it is incorrect. The problem is that Caitlyn Jenner specifically has a reason to push for policies that don't specifically affect her as someone who's incredibly wealthy and therefore able to sidestep a massive amount of like policy that is damaging to people, and therefore is likely to be like incredibly willing to accept them, because it means that she can show that she is not an inconvenience. I think that means that you can still have those policies because she herself has an incentive to endorse them. The incentive that they point out that means you can't do that is at the point where she's at the head, you can't contradict her and you can't seem inconsistent with her. When she is endorsing the inconsistency and she is endorsing the contradiction, yes, you can, and you have a good reason to, because that's what you want to do anyway. Now you have a veneer of legitimacy to do it. The uniqueness of this is that you can now do it meaningfully more. A, because she is likely to introduce a variety of new issues that people don't have an opinion on in status quo. Things like non-binary rights, things like what your insurance should cover, are all things that most people don't strongly relate to, don't have a huge amount of opinion on. At the point where their first opinion on this is shaped by its celebrity that can easily say this was not an issue for me, you shouldn't be made to pay for my transition, that is massively worse than when their first exposure to it is their cousin's transgender child who suffered, because that means that their first exposure is the kind of alienation that you get from Caitlyn Jenner, as opposed to the empathy which a lot of people are eventually likely to experience, or like across the next generation, because it is incredibly likely to come up to them. That first priming experience that makes the second one that creates empathy less likely, because you're already more hostile to transgender people, which means they're less likely to be willing to speak to you and create that empathy afterwards, is what happens when priming happens the way that you have Caitlyn Jenner doing it. Why do we think specifically this also, by the way, means that you don't get the status quo improvements? The status quo is not the worst it possibly can be, Hadar. It is incorrect for all the reasons Gwen already points out, also for everything that we pointed out in POI to CG and gotten no response to. Then in terms of weighing, we think it is more plausible that she interacts with the media and with message shaping in the way that we talk about, because there's more pressure for her at the point where she's in like primary discussions to discuss these issues and to differentiate herself from people who are less palatable to the party. But secondly, because her reference group is likely to be Republicans, which means that socially she's likely to like pander to them as opposed to pander to the LGBT community. But secondly, on group impact, I think most people who benefit from Caitlyn Jenner being a Republican already can do that now. They don't need her to run for governorship. But the people who are most vulnerable and most need acceptance are actively hurt by the things that she is doing, and that is incredibly damaging. Yeah, OG go.
Trump's bathroom bill and ban trans soldiers prove trans rights are these.
Sorry, Hadar, you're cutting out, and at this point,
both sides, so the DNC raises them and the GOP has to react.
No, sorry. I have no idea what was going on. I can't hear it properly. This sucks, but you know, I can't work with it. In terms of CG, in terms of Reconstruction, that there's status quo bad things on the agenda. You get many more things on the agenda, that's horrible. But secondly, at the point where you get many more things on the agenda and you reinforce them because they are more likely to be talked about, that also makes middle America that you say Democrats have an incentive to pander to, more necessary to pander to at direct exclusion of trans people. That means you make more concessions specifically on trans rights as the Democrats, because you need to make them more, because if you don't make them, you're more alienating to them. There's already a platform. There's a massive added demographic who watches political interviews compared to the demographic that reads tabloids. And sorry, but second, you have platforms with worse pressure, interviews on Republican stations, etc. Specifically, this is something that you have only at the point where she's running for the governorship that is bad. The notion that it forces the Democrats to compete is wrong. Because they don't just talk a big game for the reasons that Gwen talks about, but to the degree that trans people are not a swing demographic, if they don't turn out, which they can do, they still won't be, right? At that point, they are not worth trading off middle America, which we've proven has gotten worse. For all of those reasons, you get worse trans politics. That is horrible. Closing off.
Right, thank you everyone for that debate.